The sun had barely crested the rooftops of Maplebrook Lane when the knock came, sharp, insistent, and completely out of place for a Saturday morning. Frank Delaney, coffee in hand and slippers barely on, shuffled to the door, still blinking, sleep from his eyes. He opened it to find none other than Marcia Greeley, HOA president and self-appointed guardian of neighborhood standards, standing stiff as a fence post on his front step, clipboard clutched tightly to her chest. Good. "Morning, Frank," she said in the prim, clipped tone she reserved for serious violations of community harmony. She was dressed in her usual pastel power suit, her salt and pepper hair twisted into a no-nonsense bun. That bun meant business. Frank took a sip of his coffee, unconcerned. "Marcia, you're up early." She didn't return the smile. "We received a complaint about your lawn." Frank blinked. "My lawn?" Marcia nodded gravely and flipped her clipboard to the second page like she was revealing classified intel. Specifically the Gnomes. Someone reported them as visual clutter, possibly infringing on Section 4, Paragraph 12B of the Maplebrook, HOA Covenant. Frank turned his head and looked out at his front yard. 4 brightly colored garden gnomes stood proudly nestled among the marigolds and daisies. One held a fishing rod over the bird bath. Another was reading a tiny book. They'd been there for years. "You're kidding," Frank said, chuckling a little. "I'm afraid not," Marcia replied, lips pressed into a line so tight it looked painful. "We've had a formal complaint." Frank didn't need to ask who it was. There was only one person in the entire neighborhood obsessive enough to weaponize the HOA rulebook before breakfast: Karen Hensley. Karen, who lived 2 houses down. Karen, who documented violations like they were war crimes. Karen, who once sent out a 500-word email because someone left a pumpkin out in November. Karen was Maplebrook's unofficial and thoroughly unwanted watchdog. Frank raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess. Karen?" Marcia didn't answer directly. She just gave a diplomatic shrug, the kind that said, "You know and I know, but I'm not legally allowed to say it out loud." Frank rubbed the bridge of his nose. "They're gnomes, Marcia. They're not neon signs. They don't flash. They don't even move." She gave a pained smile. "I'm just here to investigate and make a note. Nothing's been decided yet." Frank glanced toward Karen's yard, which was just barely visible past the neighbors' hedges. There they were. Her. 12 flamingos. 12. Bright pink, plastic, flamingos. Standing in a semicircle like they were planning a dance recital. One wore a tiny straw hat. Another had a feather boa. They had names, apparently, though no one asked what they were. "And she's the one talking about clutter?" Frank muttered. "We're just doing our due diligence," Marcia said as she scribbled something on her clipboard. Frank didn't argue. He knew how this game worked. Marcia was just the messenger. The HOA couldn't show favoritism, even if the entire neighborhood knew Karen had been skirting the rules for years. But this time was different. After Marcia left, Frank stood for a long moment in front of his flower bed. The gnomes smiled up at him, as if cheering him on. Sheila the sassy had her hands on her hips. Gary the guitarist strummed a silent chord. Tiny Tim, barely 4 inches tall, looked particularly mischievous, like he was already plotting revenge. Frank sipped his coffee. "You know what, guys? Maybe it's time someone stood up to the Flamingo Queen." Later that day, word of the complaint spread like wildfire. Maplebrook Lane had its own small Facebook group, intended for lost pet alerts and bake sale updates, but now it lit up with gnome emojis and angry GIFs. Mrs. Finnegan from across the street posted a long rant, defending Frank's lawn decor. "Those gnomes are the only reason I go for my morning walks," she wrote, tagging half the street. Meanwhile, Karen's flamingos looked like they escaped from a Florida garage sale. Even the usually indifferent teens chimed in. Ellie Peters, 17 and allergic to drama, posted a photo of herself giving a thumbs up next to Frank's. Gnome swing set with the caption, "Gnome life." The kids on the street were the most upset. Frank had let them name the gnomes. Every spring, They helped him repaint them. He even set up a little scavenger hunt last Halloween using glow-in-the-dark versions. To them, the gnomes were part of the neighborhood. A tradition, a storybook come to life. Meanwhile, Karen's Flamingos didn't invite the same love. They weren't whimsical. They were excessive. Each one was propped on a different level of decorative rock, with some wearing tiny sunglasses or holding mini chalkboard signs that said things like "Flamingo here" and "feathered but not ruffled." Karen called it style. Everyone else called it an eyesore. Frank didn't respond to the Facebook posts. He didn't have to. The street was rallying behind him. And while he wasn't the type to lead a revolution, he also wasn't about to let a tyrant rule unchecked. The final straw came 2 days later when Karen walked past Frank's yard on her daily morning power walk. She paused, as she always did, adjusted one of her flamingos so it pointed slightly more westward, then looked directly at Frank, who was watering his petunias. "You know, some of us actually read the rule book," she said, just loud enough for him to hear. Frank didn't flinch. He just smiled. "I've been thinking about reading it myself." Karen sniffed. "Might be a good idea." Then she walked off, neon running shoes squeaking against the pavement. As she disappeared around the corner, Frank turned to his gnomes, a slow grin spreading across his face. "All right, crew," he whispered. "It's time to take things up a notch." And with that, the gears of Maplebrook's most colorful rebellion began to turn. The gnomes had been part of Frank Delaney's yard for so long, they felt like family. Not the kind of family that overstayed their welcome or brought drama to Thanksgiving. Dinner, more like quirky, dependable relatives who always made you smile. Each one had a distinct character. There was Sheila the sassy, her hand on her hip, leaning slightly like she was judging the rest of the flower bed. Gary the guitarist stood beside the bird bath with his tiny, painted-on guitar slung low, looking like a rock star lost in suburbia. Then, there was Tiny Tim, the smallest of them all, barely 4 inches tall, crouched behind a tuft of grass like he was plotting something mischievous. Frank had spent years collecting and caring for them. Every spring, he'd pull out a tiny box of acrylic paints and touch them up, always making sure their expressions were as bright and cheerful as the day he found them. The neighborhood kids loved them. They'd given the gnomes backstories, drew comics about their adventures, and even tried to sneak their own creations into the flower bed to join the crew. Frank always welcomed new recruits, so when the complaint came in, when Marcia Greeley showed up with her clipboard and HOA tone, it wasn't just Frank who was irritated, it was the entire street. Maplebrook Lane was a tightly woven little community. Not everyone got along perfectly all the time, but they had a rhythm, a balance, and, more importantly, a shared understanding of what really mattered. And Frank's gnomes, they mattered. They were part of the charm that made Maplebrook feel like home. The backlash began quietly. Mrs. Finnegan, who lived directly across from Frank and had a yappy terrier named Moose, was the first to speak up. She marched across the street later, that afternoon with a steaming cup of chamomile tea in one hand and a crumpled printout in the other. "Frank," she said, "I printed out the bylaws." Nowhere. Does it say gnomes aren't allowed? There's a vague bit about clutter, but no definitions, no measurements, nothing. Frank smiled at her, grateful. "Thanks, Martha." "Oh, I'm not doing this for you," she said with a wink. "I'm doing this for Tiny Tim. That little guy cracks me up." The next day, a petition started making the rounds. The header read, "Save the Gnomes," with a doodle of Gary strumming his guitar. By sunset, nearly everyone on the block had signed it, except for Karen, obviously, and the Pattersons, who were on vacation in Arizona. Online, things heated up even faster. The neighborhood Facebook group, typically a place for lost cat alerts, and lawnmower recommendations, erupted with support. People changed their profile pictures to gnome selfies. Frank woke up one morning to find that someone had photoshopped his gnomes into a movie poster titled "Gnome Alone, the HOA Strikes Back." Even the mailman had something to say. Mid-route on Tuesday, he paused by Frank's mailbox and leaned out the truck window. "Delaney," he called. "Don't let them take the gnomes! They're the best part of this route." Frank laughed. "I'll do my best." But not everyone was laughing. Karen, the architect of the complaint, doubled down. She was seen walking the block with a notepad, taking photos of yards, muttering about standards and slippery slopes. She wrote another email to the HOA board, citing a growing problem of lawn decor overload and demanding enforcement of neighborhood aesthetics. The next HOA meeting, she showed up with a printed slideshow. Yes, a slideshow. Frank sat near the back of the small community center room, arms crossed, trying not to roll his eyes as Karen clicked through her presentation. Slide 1 was a picture of his flower bed, zoomed in on Gary's guitar like it was some sort of offensive symbol. "This is what we're allowing now," she announced to the room, clicking to slide 2. This one showing a yard from another neighborhood, filled with inflatable penguins. "We don't want this, do we?" she asked, like she was warning everyone about the impending apocalypse. Frank waited for her to pull out a laser pointer, but thankfully, she stopped at 6 slides. Then she gave her closing statement. "If Frank gets to clutter his yard with toys, what's stopping someone from putting up inflatable dinosaurs or life-sized cutouts of Elvis?" Someone at the back murmured, "Didn't you leave your inflatable Santa out until February?" Karen stiffened. "That was seasonal." Few muffled laughs broke out. Marcia, the HOA president, cleared her throat and tried to regain control. "Let's remain respectful. We're just here to hear concerns." Frank stood up. "May I speak?" Karen narrowed her eyes but said nothing. He walked to the front and turned to face the room. "I didn't know this was going to turn into a neighborhood crisis, but since it has, let me just say one thing. The gnomes make people smile. They make kids curious. They give a little color to a street full of beige siding and identical bushes. They're not hurting anyone." A small round of applause broke out. Karen looked like she had swallowed a lemon. "But," Frank continued, "if we're going to start playing by the rulebook, maybe it's time we all did." He looked directly at Karen. Because the truth was, Karen's yard didn't just have flamingos. She had wind chimes shaped like pineapples, 2 solar-powered spinning flowers, and a flamingo-shaped mailbox she installed without HOA approval. Her yard was a shrine to whimsy, but only her version of it. Karen gave Frank a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Rules are rules." Frank nodded. "I agree." He walked back to his seat, and the meeting moved on. But something had shifted. Frank wasn't just defending his gnomes anymore. He was drawing a line. The next morning, he sat on his porch, sipping coffee, watching the sun rise over Maplebrook Lane. Kids walked past on their way to school, stopping to wave to the gnomes. A dad pushing a stroller gave Frank a thumbs up. Karen, out for her morning jog, passed by with a stiff nod and didn't say a word. Frank just smiled. She thought this was over, that she'd won a quiet victory with her email and her slideshow. But Frank had other plans. Not revenge exactly, but balance. Fairness. A little neighborly reminder that everyone's yard had quirks and no one got to play dictator with the HOA rulebook. Tiny Tim, crouched in the flower bed, seemed to wink. It started with one extra gnome. A small, pudgy figure with a red cap and sunglasses, holding a plastic margarita cup, appeared in Mrs. Finnegan's garden the morning after the HOA meeting. It stood next to her lavender bush like it had always belonged there. She called it Vacation Vinny. When asked where it came from, she only smiled and said, "Vinny knows when he's needed." By the following day, there were 3 more on the street. Then 6. Then 25. Within a week, The entire block had transformed into what looked like the headquarters of a gnome uprising. Gnomes fishing from bird baths, gnomes reclining in hammocks, gnomes riding tiny toy trucks. Some were store-bought, others clearly handmade, crafted from everything from clay to recycled soda bottles. It was like a folk art explosion, and Maplebrook Lane was the canvas. Frank, despite being at the center of it all, claimed no responsibility. Just neighbors showing their support, he told Karen, when she finally marched over to his porch. One afternoon, arms crossed, lips pursed so tightly they turned white. She gestured wildly toward the street, where a gnome sat triumphantly atop a mini plastic tricycle in Mr. Becker's driveway. "This is ridiculous!" Frank took a sip from his lemonade. "Is it? Looks like community spirit to me." Karen glared. "You think this is funny?" He shrugged. "I think it's festive." She stormed off without another word. The truth was, Frank had organized it all with a single post on the Maplebrook Facebook group. If they can come for my gnomes, they can come for anything that brings us joy. Let's remind them who really makes this neighborhood special. He didn't even have to ask twice. Dozens of neighbors responded with gnome photos, offers to paint or sculpt, and suggestions for the gnome takeover event. It became a movement. Children drew gnome murals in chalk on the sidewalk. Someone tied red ribbon to every mailbox on the block and called it the Trail of Tiny Hats. The HOA's mailbox was flooded with postcards featuring gnome puns. "Gnome, sweet gnome," and "We will not be nominated for extinction." 1. Enterprising teen, Luca, who lived next door to Karen, 3D printed a gnome that looked suspiciously like her, complete with a short haircut, pursed lips, and tiny plastic clipboard. He named it Huara the Wise, and it ended up in a front yard display surrounded by a circle of kneeling gnome worshippers. The whole street found it hilarious. Karen, of course, did not. She tried to fight back. First, she sent another strongly worded email to the HOA board filled with phrases like neighborhood anarchy and inappropriate levels of whimsy. She even attached photos labeled evidence of escalation with red arrows pointing at particularly extravagant gnome displays. But the board, wary after the backlash from her original complaint, now took a more cautious approach. "We're evaluating the community's evolving aesthetic preferences," they replied, which was HOA speak for. "We're not touching this." Karen wasn't done. Next, she tried to enforce her own counter-aesthetic by doubling down on flamingos. 12. Turned to 15. Then 20. A few were dressed like lifeguards. One wore a fake mustache. She added a solar-powered flamingo fountain that sprayed neon pink water 3 feet into the air. Her lawn began to glow at night with rotating LED lights that lit up the birds like a disco. It didn't help her cause. Instead, it made everything worse. By now, Maplebrook Lane had fully embraced its transformation into what people on social media were calling the Gnome Zone. Cars from neighboring subdivisions slowed down just to gawk. A local Instagram account featured the street in a post that got over 3,000 likes. "This neighborhood has declared open war on HOA snobs, and we're here for it." Karen's flamingos, for all their blinding color, simply couldn't compete with the charm of Tiny Tim riding a Hot Wheels Jeep, or Sheila the Sassy leading a mini parade of garden creatures down a flowerbed path. Even HOA President Marcia Greeley, who had originally brought the complaint to Frank's door, was starting to soften. Frank saw her one morning inspecting a set of gnomes someone had arranged under a bird feeder. One was holding a tiny pair of binoculars. Another had a clipboard. A third sat cross-legged reading a HOA handbook. She let out a laugh, short and quickly stifled, but a laugh all the same. Frank saw his opportunity and made his move. He invited Marcia over for coffee the next morning. She accepted, possibly out of curiosity, possibly just to escape her inbox, which was now flooded with cheerful, rhyming gnome fan mail. They sat on his porch, sipping coffee, watching the slow morning unfold. A group of neighborhood kids walked. by pointing out a new gnome Frank had put up. Detective Doug, complete with a magnifying glass and trench coat. "They're not hurting anyone," Frank said casually. Marcia sighed, not in exasperation, but more like someone who'd just accepted something inevitable. "They're surprisingly popular," Frank smiled. "Let's not pretend this was ever really about rules. Karen just wants the street to look the way she wants it to. But if everyone else wants something different, isn't that the community standard?" Marcia didn't respond right away. She looked out at the neighborhood, at the kids laughing, at the retirees tending to their gnome gardens, at the chalk drawings and miniature gnome swing sets. Even at Karen's lawn, now absurdly over-decorated, with flamingos balanced on lawn chairs and one wearing a tuxedo. "I suppose we could revisit the policy," she finally said. "Nothing wrong with a little personality." Frank gave her a toast with his mug. "To personality." Marcia smiled, then glanced down at her phone. "Just between us, someone dropped off a gnome at the HOA office yesterday. Left it on my desk. It had a sign around its neck that said, 'Make HOA fun again.'" She chuckled. "I put it on the filing cabinet." Frank laughed. "You've been gnomed." Word of Marcia's change of heart spread quickly. By the end of the week, everyone knew she was quietly proposing an HOA policy update that would allow reasonable lawn decor that contributes to neighborhood character and community engagement. The revolution had won. Karen, faced with the realization that her crusade had backfired spectacularly, began slowly removing her more outrageous flamingo additions. First went the LED lights, then the fountain. Eventually, she trimmed the flock down to its original 12. Still a lot, but no longer a battalion. Frank, magnanimous in victory, decided not to push her further. But on a quiet Thursday morning, something surprising happened. A single gnome appeared in Karen's yard. It stood next to one of her flamingos, both looking proudly out over the lawn. The gnome wore a tiny hat with a flamingo feather tucked into the brim. The flamingo had a red sash tied around its neck. No one knew if Karen had placed it there or if one of the neighborhood kids had snuck it in, but it stayed. And that, more than any rule change or Facebook post, felt like the final word. The war was over. The gnomes had not only survived, they'd been embraced. Balance had been restored to Maplebrook Lane, and in that odd, magical way that only neighborhoods can understand, the block felt more united than ever. All thanks to a few smiling garden gnomes and a stubborn man with a watering can. It was a crisp Saturday morning in late October, and Maplebrook Lane buzzed with energy. The sun cut through a gentle fog as neighbors hustled back and forth, arms full of decorations, hot cider, folding chairs, and homemade gnome hats. Frank Delaney stood at the edge of his lawn, watching it all unfold with a kind of quiet awe. Just 6 weeks ago, this same street had been locked in a cold war over lawn decor. Now it was preparing for its first ever Gnome-Coming Festival, a celebration of unity, rebellion, and the joy of being a little weird together. Frank adjusted Tiny Tim, who now sat atop a freshly painted wooden throne labeled Gnome King. 2025. Someone had even made him a gold foil crown and a velvet cape stitched from an old dog blanket. Nearby, Sheila the Sassy leaned against a flower pot filled with candy corn. Even Gary the guitarist got an upgrade. A tiny amp someone had 3D printed and painted like a vintage Marshall stack. Tables lined both sides of the street. The Walkers brought gnome-shaped cookies with little fondant beards. Mrs. Finnegan set up a paint-your-own gnome station next to her rose bushes, complete with miniature aprons for kids. Someone had rigged up a cornhole game using gnome hats as targets, and the pièce de résistance was a float, yes, a literal float, being assembled in the Johnsons' driveway, a rolling garden bed mounted on a trailer, featuring a rotating display of gnomes dressed as historical figures. George Gnomington was the crowd favorite. Even the local paper caught wind of it. A reporter from the Maple County Gazette arrived with a photographer and notebook, clearly both amused and charmed by what they'd walked into. Frank had never seen the block so alive. People were laughing, chatting, reconnecting in ways they hadn't since before the pandemic. It was more than a festival. It felt like the neighborhood had finally found its soul again. And yes, even Karen was there. She didn't show up early. She never did. But just as the festivities were hitting full stride, she stepped out of her front door, wearing a pale pink sweater and an expression that could only be described as mildly tolerant. But then, something surprising happened. She walked straight to the cider table, helped herself to a cup, and made her way toward Frank's lawn. Frank noticed and raised an eyebrow as she approached. He didn't say anything, waiting to see where she'd land. Karen took a sip of cider, stared at Tiny Tim in his throne for a moment, then glanced at Frank. "It's a good turnout." "Yeah," Frank said, cautious but cordial. "Turned out better than I expected." She nodded slowly. "It's festive. People are happy. That's something." Frank tilted his head. "You thinking of adding a few more flamingos for next year's Flamingo Fest?" A hint of a smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, but she quickly buried it in her cup. "I'm not saying I like the Gnomes," she said, "but I don't hate what it's done for the street." That was as close to an olive branch as Karen ever offered. Frank nodded. "Fair enough." She looked around. "That float is ridiculous." "I know," Frank said with a grin. "Isn't it great?" And for a few seconds, Karen didn't look like the rigid HOA enforcer she'd been. She looked like someone remembering what it felt like to be part of something messy and imperfect and full of laughter. The day continued with a gnome parade, led by Luca, the 3D printing genius, who rode his scooter in a top hat and fake beard, throwing gummy worms to the crowd. Kids followed behind him, waving flags with gnome faces. Even Marcia, the HOA president, rode in a red wagon pulled by her husband, tossing mini garden shovels as prizes. When the sun began to dip and the sky turned gold, a talent show kicked off. Frank played a silly song on his ukulele, titled Gnome Word. Bound. The Pattersons did a gnome-themed puppet skit that had everyone in stitches. And the final act? A trio of elderly neighbors doing a synchronized dance in gnome costumes to Boogie Wonderland. The street erupted in applause. Then came the awards. Best Dressed Gnome went to a ceramic piece wearing a full astronaut suit. Most Original Yard Display went to Mrs. Espinoza, who built a fairy tale scene where gnomes rode dragonflies into battle. Community Spirit went to, of course, Frank Delaney. When his name was called, the applause turned into a standing ovation. People clapped, whistled, and chanted, "Frank, Frank, Frank," like he was a hometown hero. He stood awkwardly at first, then raised a hand in gratitude. "I really didn't do much," he said into the microphone. "I just didn't want to lose something that made people smile." Someone shouted, "You gave us a reason to smile again." Frank swallowed hard. He wasn't used to praise. He wasn't trying to start a movement. He just wanted to protect his little patch of joy. But maybe that's how all good things start, with something small and sincere. As the festival wound down, people lingered on porches and sidewalks, reluctant to let the day end. Strings of fairy lights came on, casting a warm glow over the gnome-filled street. The air smelled like cider, pine mulch, and the faint sweetness of funnel cakes from a food truck someone had spontaneously hired. Frank sat back in his lawn chair, exhausted but content. He watched as kids ran between yards, gnome hats bouncing with every step. An older couple slow danced on their driveway. A group of teenagers took selfies with the gnome float under the streetlight. Karen passed by again, heading home. She paused just long enough to say, "Good job, Frank." This time, the smile wasn't hidden. "Thanks, Karen," he replied. As she walked away, he noticed something peculiar. Tucked beneath one of her flamingos was a tiny figure. It wasn't store-bought. It looked like it had been made by hand, short, round, painted with a bit of a shaky hand but unmistakable, a gnome. He chuckled to himself and leaned back, hands behind his head. The war had truly ended, not with a truce or a policy or a speech, but with a quiet little figure tucked beneath a pink bird. It was the kind of ending you couldn't script if you tried, an ending where no one lost, and everyone got just a little closer to their neighbor. Maplebrook Lane had gone from ordinary to unforgettable, not because of the HOA or the rules or even the decorations, but because they remembered that being a community meant celebrating each other's quirks. And, gnomes, they were just the beginning.